In social studies, we're going to talk about, observe, and learn about how one community changed in one city. Take a look at this. I bet this photo looks familiar to you. It is from earlier, from one of our first lessons. Do you remember the names of these three types of communities? We have urban in the center, our big city, suburban, a little farther out, full of neighborhoods, and rural, out in the country, lots of farmland, not many people at all. We looked at each type of community, how urban cities had lots of tall buildings and lots of people, and the further out that we went from an urban city, a big city, the further out that we went, the houses got further apart, the buildings got further apart, less people, and even further out to rural, past suburban to rural, even less people, less buildings, lots more land available. But within these communities, there's always change. And why do communities change? How might these communities change, and why would these changes happen? We're going to talk about that, but first, let's look at this picture. Compare these two pictures. How are they alike and different? Which shows a long time ago? Which shows today? So these two pictures, they show the city of San Francisco, California. And San Francisco grew from a small town to a large city. Maybe you've heard of San Francisco, maybe never have, but maybe you've heard of the state of California. So we're going to talk about how San Francisco grew from a small town to a really large city. Maybe one day you will go to San Francisco. It's a pretty cool city to visit. So this is San Francisco today. It's just one photograph of what San Francisco looks like. San Francisco, like I said, is in the state of California. What do you notice? What do you see? Let's zoom out a little bit. Look at this map. This is a map of the United States. We can also see a little bit of Canada and Mexico. Can you find California? It is the largest state on the west coast of the United States. And we think north, east, south, west. And San Francisco is here, where this arrow is pointing. So that's where San Francisco is in the state of California. And it's near the Pacific Ocean. Maybe you've heard of the Pacific Ocean. So when we look at this photograph of San Francisco, what type of a community would you call this? Urban, rural, or suburban? What makes you think that it's one of those communities? What do you see in the photograph? What do you notice? Do you see farmland? Do you see neighborhoods? Or do you see tall buildings all really close next to each other? This would be an urban community. When we see everything so close together and lots of tall buildings, and if we really zoomed in, we would see lots of people and taxis. We would probably see maybe like a subway system or buses going by. But something else that San Francisco has, you see a lot of water, don't you? And the water you see is San Francisco Bay. So here's a question for you. Why might the water be important to San Francisco? Where might ships dock? Which means where are they going to put their ships when they don't need to use them, or where they need to unload their ships? And finally, do you think San Francisco was always a big, busy city? So we're going to talk a little bit about how San Francisco has changed over many years into the large city that you see here, because it has not always looked like this, kind of like the city of Los Angeles. Here are some words that you might hear: harbor, earthquake, timeline. Let's do some reading. Here's the title of our chapter: How Did One Community Change? You have learned that communities grow and change. As they do, they create history. History is what has happened in the past. Now you will read how one community changed. San Francisco, California grew from a small town into a large city. Our first heading: a small town. Long ago, many big ships sailed into San Francisco's harbor on the Pacific Ocean. A harbor, this looks like it might be an important word because it's bolded in a different color. A harbor is a place with deep water where ships can stop. Many people on the ships decided to stay in San Francisco. They built houses, stores, and hotels. Sailors on the ships needed goods from the town. People in the town needed goods from the ships. At the water's edge, people built docks where ships could unload goods. This is how the town of San Francisco started to grow. We have a photograph right up here to show us in the beginning. The ships going into the harbor, and the town starting to grow. Our second heading: people find gold. In 1848, people found gold east of San Francisco. The word spread quickly around the world. Many people traveled to San Francisco on their way to look for gold. They came from other parts of our country. They came from countries far away. They came in ships. They came on horses. They came in covered wagons. Now there were many people in San Francisco. They all needed places to eat and sleep. They needed lots of other things too. From our reading, I think we know what's going to happen next. People need things, so things will need to be built. We have a photograph right down here showing things getting bigger, more ships, more buildings being built. Our next heading: becoming a city. People who look for gold are called gold miners. The miners needed food, clothing, and tents. They needed shovels to dig for gold. They needed pans to look for gold in streams. They found these things in San Francisco. People opened new stores and businesses in San Francisco to help the miners. The miners kept coming. More people arrived to open more stores. They built more roads and houses too. San Francisco grew into a small city. So we went from just a few houses to downtowns and towns and a city. We can see storefronts, shoes, and tea store, sugars and coffees, real estate. And our last heading for today, life in the city. Life in the city was not easy. People crowded the streets. There were long lines at stores. The streets were muddy and slippery. San Francisco also faced a big danger, fire. Many new houses were built of wood. People used oil and gas lamps to see at night. These lamps caused fires easily. There were not enough firefighters to keep the city safe. Still, San Francisco kept growing. We can see a picture right down here of the muddy streets. You can see horses and a hardware store. The town will just keep growing, and we will continue to learn about San Francisco.